The late 80s was a great time to be a kid. The Nintendo and Master System were head-to-head on the console side, the computer scene was still blossoming, and became a gaming option with the likes of the Amiga, and arcades were starting to churn out some classics that would spawn ongoing series in some cases. On top of all that, the 16-bit revolution was just around the corner. Kids were starting to glaze and drool over photos on magazines about games with amazing colorful graphics never seen before on the home side, something that was usually only reserved for the arcades. The possibilities at that point were just endless. As I spoke about on my R-Type video, EGM number 2 really opened my eyes on what was around the corner. More specifically, I started to see the differences right there and then in these photos right here. And that Altered Beast comparison right there by itself sold me on the 16-bit hype. But it was that one photo right here, this one, that told me I had to somehow get my hands on whatever a TurboGrafx16 was. Long story short, I did. The problem, or rather problems, of owning the console came afterwards. I'm going to cover all the pros and overwhelming missteps that the system took when it was released right here in the States. I'm going to go over all aspects, games, peripherals, and just the overall marketing decisions that would ultimately sink this console in the long run. Sit back, folks. This story, it's a painful one. Hudson Soft was no stranger to the video game market. They had been around for some time and had a familiar business venture with Nintendo on the Famicom. They also made games for the NEC computers such as the 8801, as well as the MSX and the CX Spectrum. Eventually, Hudson did create some hardware, with the C62 system being the name of their console, or rather, the chip that they were working on. Meanwhile, Nippon Electronic Company, better known as NEC, was looking to make its entry into the console market after making a splash on the computer side with their computer lineup, the PC 8800 and 9800 series. Hudson, however, needed a backer to produce hardware. NEC needed a seasoned video game maker. The two joined forces in 1987 and released the PC Engine console to compete with the Mark III and Famicom systems. The console war was beginning. Even with the popularity of the Famicom in almost full effect and the Sega Genesis still 1 year away in Japan, the PC Engine exceeded expectations. In the first week alone, it sold 500,000 consoles. To give you an idea of how that compares to the American market, in the US alone, the TurboGrafx16 only sold just over 1.6 million units during its full run. But why? The TurboGrafx16 was the next step in the game evolution. Alongside the Sega Genesis, it would usher us into the 16-bit realm, while Nintendo was stuck in... well, you get the picture. So let's go over the launch of the console here in the States first. It was released on August 29th of 1989, 15 days after the Genesis. When I say that, I am referring to the US release, since in Japan the Genesis was released almost 1 year to the day of the PC Engine. That alone wouldn't be a problem. Consoles being released that close to one another won't have a huge advantage in terms of amassing a huge sale lead. Problem here is that back in the 80s, the gaming market was still aimed and secluded mostly just to kids. There wasn't a large gaming audience with purchasing power behind them, like you do today. The market and the margin for error were smaller. So 15 days might not sound as or look like a big number, but it was enough to get the TurboGrafx off on the wrong foot. The slight delay was due to the marketing and designers figuring out what the console would look like here in the States. The team thought that the white, stylish, and miniature design of the Japanese console would not be an attractive option for the Western audience. The bulky and stylish outer shell that we came to know was the result of that redesign. Some would say that it's over-bloated. If you were to open up the casing, you would see a board that is for the most part unused on the left side here. Technically, it could have been half the size. I mean, just look at the PC Engine and its board if you want proof. The Genesis would go on to sell a 500,000 consoles versus 300,000 for the TurboGrafx16 in 1989. If the console wars can be viewed as a relay race, then the TurboGrafx had stumbled off the starting block. Marketing was adequate, with exposure on TV and magazine ads here and there, but not a lot. Those that did buy a TurboGrafx noticed one thing immediately once they unboxed the new console. Which brings me to the design and the peripherals. You figured that with such a massive new outer shell that the new console would offer new inputs that would raise the gaming experience. The Turbografx came with only one controller output, just one. Previous generation consoles came with 2 controller ports. The Atari 2600 came out with 2 controller ports. The freaking Odyssey 2 came with 2 ports. And let's not forget the Sega Genesis, which had come out 15 days prior, had 2 controller ports. So if you had the luck of knowing another human being with a Turbografx and you wanted to play a 2-player game, either co-op or versus, you were out of luck initially. I'll go into more detail on this in a bit. The Turbografx had an RF connection and an AC adapter port, the latter being connected right next to the very large and oversized expansion port. The RF cable it came with did not connect to AV composite inputs on your TV. You had to settle with the RF coaxial input. You did have other options, which I'm going to get into, but straight out of the box, it was coaxial or nothing. The controller was the lone upside to the original box content, at least for me. It didn't have any extra buttons, but it did have these switches right here that allowed you to set the auto rapid fire to use on certain games. That will come in very handy since the Turbografx will be home to many great shooters. So how could you plug in more controllers to your console? That way you could play such amazing sport titles such as Jack Nicklaus Golf, TV Sports Football, Andre Panza Kickboxing, and taking it to the hoop. Luckily, you could get a TurboTap add-on, and by luckily, I mean you had to go and spend $20 extra to buy one of these, to play one of these. There are quite a few things in this world that are against massive odds. Winning the lotto, lightning striking at the very exact same spot twice, being satisfied with buying an Atari Jaguar willingly, and having 4 friends all with Turbografx consoles, 1 multi-tap, and maybe a copy of Dungeon Explorer to enjoy. That single port really did not sit well with us Turbo owners. It didn't for me. Whoever had the bright idea of bringing that out to the market that way was just foolish. If you didn't want to use the coax connection cable that came with the console, you had to buy a turbo booster. This add-on allowed you to use a composite cable, giving you slightly better video output and audio. One of the things with the Turbografx games is that they aren't cartridges, but rather cards that are thicker than an actual credit card. This meant that there was no way for developers or companies to pack in any sort of a battery to save games on. It was too early in the gaming scene for memory cards, so NEC added a save feature to the Turbo Booster and marketed it as the Turbo Booster Plus. The regular Turbo Booster retailed at about maybe $40, so I'm pretty sure the Plus was going to be slightly more. How much so? I couldn't get that information. This added the ability to the Turbo Boosters by adding a save feature for games that supported it, like Utopia. It could also save scores, but the biggest perk here was the save feature. So Turbo owners had to shell out $20 more just to have the option of a second controller, which at that point gave you 4 more ports that you might never use, and another $40 you had to spend just to get the option to get maybe slightly better sound and video, even though when I say video, that is questionable when you think about the old CRT TVs. Meanwhile, the Genesis came out with 2 video outputs for RF and composite cables, another port in the front for headphones and a volume switch, which I used extensively, and a second port for another controller. Wow, who would have thought? Which my friend and I took advantage of as we played Golden Axe and Joe Montana football for hours on the weekends. As a Turbo owner, I was not happy. And that brings me to the games, but more specifically the launch games and the packing game. The Turbografx came packed in with Keith Courage in Alpha Zones. Not in the Alpha Zones, not and the Alpha Zones, just in Alpha Zones. I know, it sounds odd, the game felt odd too, trust me. Not because it was a bad game, it wasn't good, but it wasn't bad. You could have done much better, but the problem here is that the US audience was not aware of the property that spawned the specific game. And when a game is this bland and mediocre in terms of 16-bit greatness we were promised, you have to fall back on familiarity and love for the property that is being used. This game was based off the Japanese anime Mashin Eiyu Den Wataru, which by itself would go on to spawn a few games. What did that mean to us here in the US? Absolutely nothing. A game that if it were any more average in terms of graphics, gameplay, and music would border on utterly uninspiring. Meanwhile, the Genesis came packed in with Altered Beast. Not exactly the breakthrough 16-bit title we had all hoped for, but it had a few things going for it. One, it was a popular arcade game at that time. Whether you liked it or not, it is what it is. So the familiarity with the title was already set in place. The notion of having a game at home almost intact from a presentation point of view, one that we had to spend many quarters on, was already captivating. Now add to that the fact that we had a point of reference when it came to the power of what the new consoles would bring to the table. If you finished Keith Carriage, like I did unfortunately, you got a screen telling you that we would get a sequel. Turns out a game would follow this one on the Famicom. That is an odd choice since the PC Engine was selling pretty good in Japan. Turns out Keith Courage was the only game of the series to make it to the NEC console. The other titles being spread across some of the Nintendo consoles and the Sony PlayStation. Next, let's get to the overall games. If Keith Courage was an odd title, then the TurboGrafx16 was the mother of odd titles and decisions by the marketing team when it came to promoting the console here in the US. Now, was this due to the illegal monopoly Nintendo had on the gaming scene in the 80s by clamping down all developers to their side, or was NEC just that inept at doing their job? Take a look at the launch games for the TurboGrafx. Alien Crush, R-Type, Victory Run, China Warrior, Dungeon Explorer, Legendary Axe, Vigilante, and Power Golf. Alien Crush was probably one of the best pinball games for that time. R-Type was, is, and always will be one of the best shooters ever. Legendary Axe was a pretty solid action platformer. Vigilante was an almost pixel perfect port of the arcade game. Power Golf was another game, sports title, and out of all the other more exciting sports that they could have targeted, they went with golf. For the most part, the list of games is not that bad. But then we get to Dungeon Explorer, which on its own can be a good game. What would make it a great game is if the console had another port to play co-op with a friend. So the launch lineup, it wasn't terrible. In fact, I would say that the lineup was better than the Genesis US lineup. But then came the rest of the library. On the TurboGrafx side, you ended up with games such as Ballistics, Darkwing Duck, JJ and Jeff, Time Ball, the TV sport games, not the worst, but they were a pain to play a full game on. Bravo Man, Deep Blue. The Genesis in the meantime was getting such games as Ghouls and Ghosts, Revenge of Shinobi, or any of the Shinobi games on the Genesis, 3 Phantasy Star titles, Mystic Warrior, Streets of Rage, Sonic, Strider, you get the idea. Even the good TurboGrafx game had a hard time competing with these and other good Genesis titles. The library was mismatched with the American gamers for the most part, and Turbo owners always felt that they were lagging behind in that department. Some gems would make it out of the piles of mediocrity, but they were sometimes so spread out that it felt like we were never gonna get a good title from time to time. So just 3 months later, they launched the CD-ROM add-on with 2 games, Fighting Street and Monster Lair. Not exactly the stellar titles the CD-ROM add-on is known for. On top of such a weak lineup of games for it was the pricing. The TurboGrafx alone was $200 on launch, which adjusted for inflation would be almost $500 today. That's not a problem seeing as how the Genesis was priced about the same. On top of the fact we Turbo owners had to dish out for something as simple as another controller port on the base system, the CD-ROM drive was a massive $400. That's almost $1,000 today. That's with no games. The CD-ROM would be home to some truly amazing titles for that time, with Ease being right up there at the top of the list. It's a huge shame that we never got a copy of Rondo of Blood here in the States. Not sure if this was due to Konami being in some kind of a contractual obligation with Nintendo, or because the game came out after NEC had already given up with the TurboGrafx in the US. The contract argument is credible to me since the PC Engine did house many Konami titles back in Japan. The TurboGrafx was also home to some of the best side-scrolling shooters outside the arcades with some of the most amazing soundtracks to boot. Too bad they were all stuck behind a gate only accessible to the rich kids. Now, I'm not sure how accurate this is, but I've heard from other people that NEC did not allow their games for the TurboGrafx to be rented out by video game stores, and that was a big deal back in the 1990s. That was our way to go ahead and experiment on a game before purchasing. Once the Genesis came out and the Super Nintendo, their games were available for rent. I never saw any of the TurboGrafx games being available for rental in any of the video stores that I went to. I'm pretty sure if that was the case, then that could have also hurt sales overall for games, since back then we did not have YouTube, we did not have the internet. We could not play it unless we saw it at a kiosk or we had the ability to rent the game for a weekend or two.
You can rent them from Blockbuster. They've got more of the coolest new Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis games for rent than anyone in the world.
Sales of the TurboGrafx and CD-ROM add-on in the States by the end of 1990 would only total a bit under 800,000 units. By comparison, the Genesis had already reached 1.5 million by itself. No CD add-on. The TurboGrafx alone would finally breach the million milestone by 1991, thanks in part to a great year selling almost 1 million units. Unfortunately, NEC saw the writing on the wall. Sega Genesis had cemented itself as the true jumping platform to the 16-bit market, with the Super NES being released that same year in America on August 23rd. The two companies that had gone head-to-head with one another during the 8-bit era were now set to start the famous console wars of the early 1990s. NEC had bowed out from making it a three-way war. So, quick recap. NEC had a full year head start on the 16-bit market in Japan and could have done the same here in America, but they refused to use the existing PC Engine casing that would have allowed them to save money and time. Both could have been used favorably towards marketing. Remember, every sale counted. Every console and game moved onto gamers mattered greatly. The Christmas of 1989 would prove costly. The Genesis provided better known titles, most of them transitioning from arcade hits. Two-player games such as Golden Axe and sport games helped the Genesis make its claim during the first 2 years. Having to buy additional peripherals for the Turbo to do things that the Genesis could do right out of the box did not help, and Turbo owners such as myself saw that right away. Sure, we were kids, we were not stupid. What was stupid was releasing a home console with only one controller port and forcing kids to get a Turbo tab with 5 ports to play two-player games. Let that one sink in for a few seconds. As far as the lone salvation we Turbo owners saw in the CD-ROM was quickly squashed by the price point and the weak launch lineup it had. Being poor and having a TurboGrafx was not a good combination. Simple as that. Marketing for the Turbo was rare. I don't recall ever seeing more than maybe 3 commercials on TV, yet Sega went all out on the TV ads, magazine, contests, and other TV exposure that could have helped it sink into the minds of young gamers, including myself, who already owned a TurboGrafx16, yet wishing I could get my hands on a Genesis. Sega's marketing was working. Besides, their sights and worries were set on another console. Don't get me wrong, I love the TurboGrafx16 for what it could be. I saw the potential. I feel the console was horribly marketed, much to my dismay and that of all Turbo owners out there. Some of the games released were baffling. Other titles that we felt should have been amazing faltered. And those that we saw as the next evolution of gaming were out of reach due to the high pricing of the CD-ROM or just were not released here in the States at all. I really don't recall what happened to my TurboGrafx console. It was still working fine when I got rid of it. I had already moved on to the Genesis, the Super NES, and was already eyeballing the Neo Geo for some time. But make no mistake, there are some really great titles to be played on the TurboGrafx16 even today. Some of the best overhead and side shooters, followed by some unique titles found nowhere else during that time, could be found on this system right here. But unfortunately, with NEC pulling out of the race by 1991, most Turbo users would have to jump ship or suffer a dwindling library of games and vastly outdated technology by 93. Had NEC just released the TurboGrafx in 87, 88 maybe, here in the States, they would have had a full year head start, and who knows, maybe the gaming landscape would look a bit different today. So those out there that had the TurboGrafx16, were you satisfied with the purchase at that time? Was the CD-ROM add-on something that you had or wanted? Share your stories with us all. I also have a subreddit for my channel where you can share stories there as well as just post other gaming or movie related topics. Heck, you can even share ideas for topics I can discuss for future videos. Anyway, thanks to all for watching. Until next video, keep watching, keep gaming, and as always, take care of yourselves.
got to run before you beat me. Try again, kid.